Although the most common situation for a pair of countries to find themselves in is relative cooperation, the world is very big. There are lots of pairs of countries, and where conflict does happen, it tends to be exceptionally costly, and it also drives a whole bunch more of the headlines. Consequently, our goal for today is to understand the fundamental problem of conflict and cooperation in international relations, where it arises, how it arises in multiple cases that on the surface do not look all that similar, but when you dig down deep and think about the strategic interaction are actually essentially identical, and also what states do to try to resolve this problem, given the inherent limitations of strategies in international relations. And actually, that is where we are going to start things off today. If I had to summarize the origin of this fundamental problem of conflict and cooperation in international relations in a single word, it would be anarchy. That would be the international system that countries coexist or try to coexist in. Anarchy is the absence of some sort of binding governmental authority that supersedes individual states. Sure, we have international organizations that purport to try to do something like that, such as the United Nations, which may be the most prominent of all of these. But the thing about the United Nations, as you will recall, is that the UN cannot enforce any of the things that it tries to impose. It instead has to rely on the member countries to impose those policies themselves, or convince members of the United Nations to force those policies onto countries that might otherwise not want to comply. The bad news is that the absence of such a powerful international body, with the ability to enforce the policies that it creates, is what allows states to get into conflict with one another in the first place. The good news, and fortunately there is good news here, is that anarchy does not mean chaos. It just means the absence of order. That, in turn, allows the states to figure out ways to coexist with one another, if not create more centralized authority between them. However, anarchy might limit the scope of cooperation between a pair of countries, and given that there will be cooperation between a pair of countries, it might also restrict the nature of that cooperation and force those countries to think long and hard about how they want to interact with one another to instill cooperation from the other side. In other words, to figure out ways to self-enforce cooperation between the two. But to discipline our conversation a bit, what I want to focus on today are the interesting and puzzling cases. I'll be a little bit more rigorous with my definition of what is interesting and puzzling in a moment, but it might help to illustrate what is not particularly interesting. For example, we should not be puzzled when states that naturally like each other want to cooperate with one another. On the flip side, if you have a pair of countries that do not like each other, then it is not altogether surprising that they might get into conflict with one another. Rather, the puzzling cases are situations where there is consensus between states that in a particular situation, maybe not every situation between the two states, but in some particular situation, there is consensus that mutual cooperation would be better for both parties, and yet what ends up happening is that they both do not act cooperatively toward each other. They end up in conflict. Of course, it would be all too easy to just chalk that up to anarchy, but as you will remember, anarchy allows states to cooperate with one another. So it is a bit of a puzzle for us as social scientists to understand how they could fail to end up cooperating with one another, again, even if there is consensus that mutual cooperation would be better for both parties than the alternative. Let me give you a couple of examples to illustrate what I mean. How about Iran and Saudi Arabia? Those two countries do not particularly like each other, and indeed, if you sat the both of them in a room and had them discuss a wide variety of issues, I would bet that you would reach an impasse on quite a few of them. But one where you might not reach an impasse on is what happens with the development of nuclear weapons between the two parties. Let's compare a world where both develop nuclear weapons to a world where neither has nuclear weapons. Well, compared to the baseline, both having nuclear weapons is not going to do much to alter the balance of power between them. Sure, one of them might get some sort of slight advantage. Perhaps Iran is more concerned about countries invading the Iranian homeland, and as a consequence, Iran having nuclear weapons would deter that, and that is a greater concern to Iran than Saudi Arabia. Okay, so Iran might get some sort of slight extra benefit from the development of nuclear weapons. But again, by and large, the balance of power between the two would not change all that much if both had nuclear weapons. However, the mutual development of nuclear weapons comes with all sorts of downsides. Looking at them individually for a moment, the costs of developing nuclear weapons and then maintaining them are enormous. There is a public perception that nuclear weapons can be built on the cheap, and if you are interested in developing a very sleek military, then nuclear weapons are the way to go because they are going to be more efficient than anything else. But the reality is, as I said, these things are incredibly expensive. The United States, for example, during the Cold War period of about 45 years or so, spent more on its nuclear weapons and nuclear-related infrastructure than almost anything else. The only things that exceeded it were conventional military spending and Social Security. That's it. Meanwhile, looking back at the international stage, the more countries that have nuclear weapons, the greater the risk is of some sort of accidental nuclear strike. You can imagine a situation where Iran is looking at its radar system and sees what appear to be Saudi Arabian nuclear weapons coming in to attack Iran. What is Iran supposed to do next? Well, it could be the case that Saudi Arabia is firing those alleged nuclear weapons at Iran's nuclear weapons, thereby denying Iran the ability to fire nuclear weapons right back. That puts Iran in a use it or lose it situation, and so you might get Iran firing those nuclear weapons at Saudi Arabia. But if all along those radar systems were actually looking at false alarms, Saudi Arabia had previously not been firing nuclear weapons at Iran, but now Iran is firing real nuclear weapons at Saudi Arabia, which means Saudi Arabia might be firing real nuclear weapons back at Iran. None of that happens if neither of those countries has nuclear weapons to begin with. You could also be worried about command and control issues. Maybe there's a rogue general inside of Saudi Arabia that decides now is the time for glory, and if we fire nuclear weapons at Iran right this minute, we will win, against the wishes of the government of Saudi Arabia. Well, Iran is not going to be able to reason that it is a rogue actor inside of Saudi Arabia firing these nuclear weapons, so when those nuclear weapons do start coming toward Iran, Iran is liable to fire nuclear weapons back. Once again, this is the type of thing that cannot happen when neither country has nuclear weapons. All right, let's put those two pieces of information together. If both countries have nuclear weapons, there is basically no change to the balance of power between them. But both countries having nuclear weapons will cost both countries a whole lot of money and increase the risks associated with accidental nuclear war or rogue actors starting a nuclear war. Those are both very bad things for Iran and Saudi Arabia. And so it is very reasonable to conclude that there would be consensus in both Iran and Saudi Arabia that both countries not having nuclear weapons will be better for both parties, both individually and collectively, than when both countries do have nuclear weapons. Now, fortunately, as I am saying these words, neither country currently has nuclear weapons, and that's probably, again, a good thing for both of them. But this isn't always the case, and you can think about other countries historically, say the United States and the Soviet Union, where that sort of logic failed. And for a very long period of time, both of these countries competed with one another, and both with nuclear weapons, and a high risk of accidental nuclear war between them. Well, that type of thing is a bit of a puzzle. Why is it the case that both countries might have a consensus that having no nuclear weapons between them is better than both countries having nuclear weapons, and yet you have a continuation and a persistence of both countries having nuclear weapons? That is bad for both parties, and yet it happens in international relations. Why is that the case? That's the type of puzzle that we might want to answer. Moving to another example, I think an interesting facet of this cooperation problem is that it arises between countries that are ordinarily friendly with one another. This isn't just a problem for countries that dislike each other and are trying to find ways to make things a little bit better given their inherent problems. We've talked before about a problem with the NATO alliance. If you want your alliance to be performing as optimally as it can be, You need all the countries in your alliance to be individually spending lots of money on their militaries, so that when you come together, your collection of militaries is extremely powerful. But simultaneously, there is an individual incentive for countries to free ride, or at least try to free ride, on other countries spending that money. In other words, if I am a country like Spain, maybe I'm thinking to myself that Portugal and Belgium and the United Kingdom and France and Italy and a bunch of others are all going to be spending a lot of money on their militaries, and my marginal contribution to the alliance will be relatively minimal. So why don't I just rely on all the other countries spending the money, while I myself don't spend very much money? And you know what? Even if those other countries are also spending a whole bunch of money, or not spending a whole bunch of money, it doesn't actually matter all that much to me because, again, my marginal impact on the alliance is going to be relatively minimal. So whatever I do, regardless of what everyone else is doing, perhaps it's better for me to just spend my money on my domestic spending priorities rather than thinking about developing a military and helping out the alliance, because I myself do not internalize all of the benefits of the development of those military technologies. Those benefits are accrued amongst a whole bunch of other countries, not just myself. And as you know, this is not some sort of hypothetical problem. You had the Wales Summit back in 2014 in the wake of Russia annexing Crimea and beginning that shadow war in the Donbas region of Ukraine. At that summit, you had all of the allies agreeing to spend at least 2% of GDP on defense. But what happened in the aftermath? Some countries were already doing that. Some countries very, very slowly moved up, and then a whole bunch of countries just basically did nothing at all. Fast forward 8 years to 2022, and what happens? Well, Russia engages in a full-fledged invasion of Ukraine. NATO countries, who had not been reaching that 2% goal set at Wales, meantime do not have enough equipment on hand to be able to ship over to Ukraine to allow Ukraine to dispatch Russia in short order. And as a consequence, the war trails on. Now, over the course of the war, more and more countries began realizing that they could be in a situation similar to Ukraine, and so it was in their own individual interest, never mind the alliance's interest, to increase their individual defense spending. And so you had more and more countries reaching that 2% goal, but far later than what would have been optimal for the alliance overall. So again, we have a situation where there might be consensus among multiple actors that cooperating with one another, in this sense increasing military spending to meet the alliance's goals, will be better than a world where no one cooperates with one another and everyone has relatively low defense spending inside of the alliance. Fast forward another 3 years to 2025, and not only do we have higher fidelity logos of the summits, we also have recognition from NATO that 2% spending of GDP is not good enough anymore, and countries need to kick it up to 3.5% core spending, an additional 1.5% spending on miscellaneous goods related to the military. However, once more, that is a collective realization about what optimal spending is for the alliance overall, and each country individually has to decide whether to contribute to it or not, and you may very well find some countries thinking to themselves, well, my contribution is going to be relatively small compared to everyone else's, so regardless of what everyone else is doing, perhaps it's better for me to not spend, and if everyone else is spending, great. If no one else is spending, that's unfortunate, but once again, my contribution to this is relatively small, so I'm not really going to internalize much of the effects of that underspending. So now that we've seen a couple of examples of this logic in action, let's try to understand the commonalities not only of those two examples, but other situations that arise broadly in international relations. Let's understand why the individual incentives of countries sabotage collective cooperation among many countries. And then eventually we will transition into trying to understand how countries might go about resolving this problem, and more importantly, trying to enforce those sorts of resolutions. Going back to Iran and Saudi Arabia as our motivating example, let's imagine a very simplified world where each of the countries has to decide between one of two choices: to cooperate or defect. To cooperate means I am not going to develop nuclear weapons in this context, and to defect means I am going to develop nuclear weapons in this context. As I said, this is a very simplified interaction. In practice, with nuclear weapons alone, you would have to decide things like how fast to build nuclear weapons, what sort of delivery mechanisms do you want for those nuclear weapons, where do you want to deploy those nuclear weapons, how many nuclear weapons do you want to build, and so forth. And in later lectures, we will start thinking about more complicated interactions than just this. But the point of the interaction that I'm trying to convey to you today is that there is something fundamental across a whole bunch of different cases that look like this sort of thing, where there's decisions whether to act cooperatively or not cooperatively with the other party, and the incentive structure that is put forth under those circumstances leads to situations where we get bad outcomes. As a broader social science point, we are starting with a very simple interaction because it is helpful to understand how simple interactions work before you expand out into more complicated interactions. Sure enough, as we go later on into these lectures, we will see more complicated interactions than just this one. In fact, we will see something a little bit more complicated than this later in this lecture. But mastering the simple cases makes it easier for us to comprehend the more complicated cases later on. To draw an analogy here, you would not learn calculus before you learn multiplication, and you would not learn multiplication before you learn addition. So we're starting with the addition and then building up to more complicated worlds. And the funny thing is that when we eventually get to those more complicated interactions, what we may ultimately see some of the time is that those complicated interactions are just window dressing for what is ultimately this simple interaction. So learning this simple interaction may actually tell us everything that we need to know about the more complicated interactions once we start breaking apart those more complicated interactions. Okay, so to actually analyze this, an important thing to understand about strategic interactions is that the quality of the outcome that you get is not only a function of what you are doing, but also a function of what others are doing. So for Iran to comprehend how good of an outcome it is going to get by cooperating, it also needs to be thinking about whether Saudi Arabia is cooperating or defecting. Or if Iran is defecting, it also needs to be thinking about how Saudi Arabia is choosing its strategy, whether Saudi Arabia is cooperating or defecting. So what I'm going to do now is post the relative feelings for each of the countries associated with the four possible outcomes. So here, the rustic color is corresponding to Iran's outcomes, and the green color is corresponding to Saudi Arabia's outcomes. The more thumbs up that you have, the better, and you're really trying to avoid getting a thumbs down, never mind getting multiple thumbs down. Let's quickly go through how Iran feels about each of these outcomes. Iran's favorite outcome is to defect while Saudi Arabia cooperates. You can see that with the two rustic thumbs up for the defect cooperate outcome, defect in the row, cooperate in the column. The reason for this is that Iran has developed nuclear weapons, Saudi Arabia has not, which means Saudi Arabia is vulnerable, and Iran can coerce Saudi Arabia. Sure, there are costs associated with developing nuclear weapons, and even if you are the only country in the bilateral relationship to have a nuclear weapon, there are still risks associated with that. But you are very pleased with this outcome if you're Iran, and then, as a consequence, you have two thumbs up for that particular outcome. For basically all of those same reasons, but in reverse, the worst outcome for Iran is for Iran to cooperate while Saudi Arabia defects. That would mean that Saudi Arabia has the nuclear weapon that can coerce Iran, and Iran is unprotected. So sure, Iran has saved a little bit of costs in developing a nuclear weapon, but they're in deep trouble. Then, outside of those extremes, and as we've been talking about throughout this lecture thus far, if you consider mutual cooperation and mutual defection, mutual cooperation is better for Iran than mutual defection. In other words, both not having nuclear weapons is better than both having nuclear weapons. Once more, for all of the same reasons as before. There's no security threats as it relates to accidental nuclear war or a rogue nuclear actor, nor are you paying the costs of war. The balance of power is relatively consistent, so you prefer mutual cooperation to mutual defection. Thus, to recap this entire system, Iran most prefers defecting while Saudi Arabia cooperates. Iran gets to take advantage of the situation. The next best outcome for Iran is mutual cooperation between the two parties. The next favorite outcome for Iran is mutual defection between the two parties. And Iran's least favorite outcome is Iran cooperates while Saudi Arabia defects. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia has the exact same preferences, but flip-flopping the actions between the two parties. Saudi Arabia most likes it when Saudi Arabia is the one that's defecting while Iran is cooperating. Next best outcome for Saudi Arabia is mutual cooperation. Next best outcome for Saudi Arabia is mutual defection. And the worst outcome for Saudi Arabia is Saudi Arabia cooperates while Iran chooses to defect. Okay, well, given these preferences and these actions available to the two countries, let's think through how strategic countries would behave under this circumstance. You might think that this is going to be fairly complicated, that Iran is going to have to think deeply about what Saudi Arabia is choosing to do, and then respond accordingly, and then maybe have to think hard about how to figure out what Saudi Arabia is going to do, get some intelligence services in there to figure things out, get some other sort of spycraft, maybe get some satellites to look in, all sorts of complicated stuff, in order for Iran to figure out what is best to do. It turns out, though, that this sort of strategic environment is actually very straightforward in terms of the execution of the plan. And you can see why if we isolate what Saudi Arabia's decision is, and then use that information to make an inference about how Iran should think about this game. So let's think for a moment and suppose that Saudi Arabia is going to cooperate. For whatever reason, Iranian officials have just decided that Saudi Arabia is definitely going to cooperate. How should Iran behave in response? Well, you will notice that I have erased a whole bunch of information from the screen, and that is because all of that information is irrelevant from Iran's perspective when Iran is making this decision. If Iran can anticipate that Saudi Arabia will cooperate, the only two things that matter for Iran's decision here are how Iran feels about mutual cooperation and how Iran feels about defecting while Saudi Arabia is cooperating. And you can see here that Iran prefers to defect under this circumstance because it wants to take advantage of the situation and be the only one to develop a nuclear weapon. It prefers that outcome to the situation where neither country has a nuclear weapon. Thus, conditional on Saudi Arabia choosing to cooperate, Iran would want to choose to defect. Okay, what about the opposite circumstance? What if Iran can anticipate that Saudi Arabia is going to choose to defect? What should Iran do now? Well, again, there are only two pieces of information left on the screen because only two pieces of information matter for Iran's decision here. Iran needs to think about the quality of the outcome if it cooperates while Saudi Arabia chooses to defect, and Iran needs to think about the quality of its outcome if both choose to defect. Okay, well, if Iran cooperates while Saudi Arabia defects, that means Saudi Arabia has the nuclear weapon and Iran can now be exploited. That is very bad for Iran, and Iran prefers the situation where Iran also has nuclear weapons to counteract Saudi Arabia's nuclear weapons. Thus, conditional on Saudi Arabia choosing to defect, Iran prefers to defect as well. And therefore, we arrive at a simple conclusion for what Iran should do here. It turns out that Saudi Arabia's decision is irrelevant from Iran's perspective when Iran is trying to choose the optimal strategy. Regardless of what Saudi Arabia does, Iran is better off defecting. If Saudi Arabia wants to cooperate, Iran should defect and not cooperate. If Saudi Arabia wants to defect, once again, Iran should defect and not cooperate. So it's a very easy interaction for Iran to reason through. It doesn't actually have to correctly guess what Saudi Arabia is going to do, because Saudi Arabia's decision is irrelevant for the quality of Iran's strategic choice. It will matter for the ultimate outcome of the interaction, but in terms of Iran choosing the best strategy for it to adopt, Saudi Arabia's strategy is irrelevant. Very quickly now, let's just verify that Saudi Arabia's situation is similar, which should make sense because it was just flip-flopping everything else with its preferences. If Saudi Arabia can guess ahead of time that Iran is going to choose to cooperate, well, yes, Saudi Arabia chooses to defect instead because defection, developing nuclear weapons while Iran does not have nuclear weapons, is better for Saudi Arabia than the world where neither country has nuclear weapons. And similarly, if Iran were to defect, and Saudi Arabia could anticipate that ahead of time, Saudi Arabia would prefer to defect instead of cooperate, because if Saudi Arabia cooperates, then Iran is going to exploit it because Iran has nuclear weapons and Saudi Arabia does not. But meanwhile, mutual defection means that Saudi Arabia has the nuclear weapons to counteract Iran's coercion. Now, going back to the interaction overall, we can safely say what two strategic players with these preferences would want to do under these circumstances. They would both want to defect, and so we get an outcome that ends up looking like this, where both parties are relatively dissatisfied with the outcome, but simultaneously, they can't do better conditional on what the other person is doing. Given that the other person is defecting, it makes sense for Iran to choose to defect, and given what the other person is doing, it makes sense for Saudi Arabia to choose to defect. And indeed, regardless of what the other party is choosing to do, it is always going to be better for the party in question to choose to defect. This is why you get at this outcome and why, in this sort of system, with this sort of incentive structure, with these sorts of preferences, you are doomed to getting a relatively bad outcome to the interaction. Now, this set of preferences overall, where one player prefers to defect while the other one is going to cooperate, then mutual cooperation, then mutual defection, then the other person choosing to defect while the person in question chooses to cooperate, that sort of incentive structure has a specific name in strategic thinking. It's called a prisoner's dilemma, and it gets that name because this is a common trope that you will see not only in television, but also to some degree in real life, when you have a couple of would-be criminals arrested and under suspicion of doing something much worse than what the police are currently planning on charging them with. This is the situation where the police would sequester the alleged criminals in separate interrogation chambers and offer them some sort of deal where if each of them individually chooses to rat out the other side, to defect from this relationship with their fellow compatriot in crime, then the police will go easy on the rat, but then punish the person who kept quiet. And if you have an incentive structure that is built in the way that we just saw in the previous slide, then each of those individual criminals have an individual incentive to want to defect on the other party, and that allows the police to get the confessions that they need to overall put both of the criminals in jail for an extended period of time. And while this tends to be the first sort of strategic interaction that students will see when they are starting to learn how to think strategically, it turns out, again, that this game, from a strategic perspective, is not very interesting. Imagine that I gave you a variant of chess, where instead of having a fixed board that has 8 pawns, 2 rooks, 2 knights, and so forth, other than the king, I allowed you to choose which piece that you wanted to make. In other words, we could have that first pawn be a pawn, or it could be a knight, or it could be a rook, or it could be a bishop, or it could be a queen. And we do that for all 15 pieces of the board that's not the singular king. What would you do under that circumstance? Well, very obviously, you would choose to have every single one of your pieces be a queen. That type of decision-making in a game of chess that I have modified in that way is not very interesting, because it is blatantly transparent exactly how you should behave in that strategic interaction. Same thing here. This is very straightforward to understand that it doesn't matter what the other side is doing, you should want to choose to defect. It doesn't matter what the other side is doing with the chessboard, you should want to make all of your pieces queens. So, again, from a strategic perspective, this type of interaction is entirely uninteresting. You just do the thing that's always best regardless of what the other one is doing. Not interesting. But from an efficiency perspective, it is very interesting. And to explain why, I need to first introduce you to the notion of efficiency that social scientists use, which is something known as Pareto efficiency. We say that an outcome is Pareto efficient if no other outcome makes someone better off without making someone else worse off. This is a notion of efficiency that comes from an Italian economist, which is why it's called Pareto efficiency. And what you need to focus on here is the outcome of this interaction that we would expect, and a singular alternative outcome that I have been alluding to throughout this lecture, which is a comparison of mutual defection to mutual cooperation. And if we just look to that definition and compare these two outcomes, mutual cooperation is Pareto efficient, mutual defection is not. It is Pareto inefficient. And it's just obvious looking at the 2 thumbs up versus the 2 thumbs down. Both Iran and Saudi Arabia would prefer to move from mutual defection to mutual cooperation. And that is the bulk of Pareto efficiency. The definition leaves open one slight caveat, though, rereading the definition, an outcome is Pareto efficient if no other outcome makes someone better off without making someone else worse off. So if we go to that mutual cooperation outcome and turn it so that Saudi Arabia has its thumb down while Iran still has its thumb up, so that would look like this. And going by the definition, mutual cooperation is still Pareto efficient, whereas mutual defection is still Pareto inefficient, because you could go from mutual defection to mutual cooperation and make Iran better off without making Saudi Arabia worse off. So Pareto efficiency is very easy to look at when we're in a situation that's back to the normal way, where we have both parties being made better off, but it also allows for indifference between one of the parties as long as the other party in a two-person interaction is being made better off. Now, the reason that we care so much about Pareto efficiency in social sciences is that if we ever reach an inefficient outcome in the real world, it is a tragedy. The extent of the tragedy will depend on just how inefficient the system is. But at some level, we could be looking at an alternative set of circumstances where we have a separate outcome, a different outcome than what is happening, and someone is going to be happier. Perhaps everyone is going to be made happier by switching from the current outcome to the alternative hypothetical outcome. And it's not going to make anyone worse off. So no one would want to veto that if we could have some sort of, and this is the key word, some sort of binding contract that moves us from one outcome to the other. Consequently, one of the primary tasks we have as social scientists is to explain why inefficient outcomes happen in the real world. We see one happening, we have to explain why that's the case. And I alluded to what the explanation is here, that problem with binding contracts. Yes, it is true that mutual cooperation is better for both parties than mutual defection, but putting everything else back up here, if we just isolate one of the parties at a time, for example, Iran's individual incentives are to defect, again, regardless of what Saudi Arabia is doing. And likewise, Saudi Arabia's individual incentives are to defect regardless of what Iran is doing. So those individual incentives mean that both end up defecting. To try to switch to that world of mutual cooperation, you would have to ask one of the parties to do something that is not in their direct interests and allow the other party then to exploit them. So, for example, Iran would love to sit Saudi Arabia down in a room and say, "Hey, Saudi Arabia, did you know that mutual defection is bad for both of us and mutual cooperation is better for both of us? So because it is better for both of us to cooperate, we're going to go ahead and cooperate. And so when you have to go ahead and make your decision about whether to build nuclear weapons, you should not build a nuclear weapon because we're going to cooperate with you. Trust us, it will be fine. You cooperate, I cooperate, we all cooperate. Everyone is better off as a consequence." But then the diplomats go back to their respective capitals and think to themselves, wait a minute, hold on. If we've convinced them to go ahead and cooperate with us, we can take advantage of this situation and defect. We can build nuclear weapons while the other side foolishly chooses not to build nuclear weapons, and that's going to be great for us because we'll be able to exploit them once we have the nuclear weapons and they do not have the nuclear weapons. So that is why you can have a situation that is simultaneously not interesting strategically, but from an efficiency perspective, very interesting. This tells us that individual incentives might not always align with the collective incentives, and for a particular situation like this with prisoner's dilemma payoffs, we end up in a circumstance where both of us are made worse off because of our inability to commit to the cooperative action. It is the joy of anarchy once again. But to continue a theme not only of this lecture, but all of the lectures that we'll have, anarchy does not doom the countries to be in this situation. Yeah, this might be the first-run incentives that both of the parties face, but you're not locked into this interaction necessarily. There may be ways for you to fix these sorts of problems and get out of the situation. Now, unfortunately, some of those solutions might not be available, and ultimately we may end up being stuck here, and anarchy may doom us to a situation where it would be great if we had external enforcement, but we just don't have the external enforcement, and there's nothing that we can do about it. But certainly in practice, we do see states realizing that these sorts of situations are problems and are actively looking for solutions to this sort of problem. And broadly speaking, we can categorize those sorts of solutions as self-enforcing solutions, where the countries are interacting in ways that are trying to figure out and regulate this system to move from mutual defection to mutual cooperation. And then alternatively, we could think about solutions to this problem that do not involve self-enforcement, but rather are fundamentally changing the interaction entirely. We're going to start with that second category because that second category is a little bit easier to analyze. Well, the simplest solution to the problem is to extract yourself from the situation. Stop playing the prisoner's dilemma. If you and the other country are going to be in a situation where you're just going to keep defecting on one another, and mutual defection is bad, then stop doing it. Leave the situation. Get out of the abusive relationship. And indeed, if you are in your personal life and you're finding problems with prisoner's dilemmas, that tends to be the solution. If you have a friend or a partner or never mind a spouse, and you and that other individual have prisoner's dilemma style preferences with each other, then that is going to result in a lot of unhappy outcomes. And so the way that you solve that problem is by simply ending that relationship, whether it's a friend, whether it's a partner, or whether it's a spouse. Going back to those payoffs, the types of people that you want to have in your everyday life should not have preferences like this, and you should not have preferences with them like that either. You probably want to find yourself people that have preferences that look like this, and for whom you have preferences that look like this as well, where mutual cooperation is agreed upon as the best outcome for both parties. And when you have that sort of preference relation, then you can get sustained mutual cooperation. If Iran knows that Saudi Arabia is going to cooperate, Iran wants to cooperate here because that allows Iran to get its best possible outcome. And vice versa for Saudi Arabia. If Saudi Arabia knows that Iran is going to cooperate, then Saudi Arabia wants to cooperate as well, because that allows Saudi Arabia to get its best possible outcome. Practically speaking, though, this is not going to define every relationship that we have in our life. You'll find yourself in situations with maybe a TA or a professor or a boss that have preferences that look closer to this. And you're kind of just stuck in these sorts of situations because to leave the interaction is going to be too costly for you. You can't just quit the class because then you can't get a degree. You can't just quit your job because then you don't get a paycheck. So it would help if you could find some sort of solution to this problem that does not just rely on having individuals have the best preferences possible, those very cooperative and nice preferences. Unfortunately, the world of international relations looks more like that, where you're kind of just stuck in these situations and you have to play them out. The reason that I had an image of an isolated island from before when I was introducing the idea of just quitting and going out and living on your own is that this is, again, exactly not how international relations works. You can't just isolate yourself on an island and pretend that other countries do not exist. If you're Saudi Arabia and thinking about it, the situation with Iran, you cannot just pretend that Iran does not exist and say, I refuse to play the prisoner's dilemma. Because if you try doing that, what happens next is that Iran develops a nuclear weapon, you have de facto chosen to cooperate by not playing, and you end up in a world where now you are easily exploited. So this is not a good solution at all for states. States have to figure out better solutions than just that. Okay, well, let's turn to the world of organized crime to try to find a different solution. Because they actually have this down. They figured it out. If you're a member of a cartel or the mafia or something like that, and you get arrested, and you're sequestered in one of those interrogation rooms, the police officer comes over and says, hey, here's the deal on the table. What do you want to do? You have a strong incentive under those circumstances, again, if you were a member of a cartel, to just not say anything. Because the cartel will act as an external enforcer. Sure, the police may be offering you a sweetheart deal, and if you were only looking at the amount of time that you'd be spending in jail, you would want to rat out your fellow compatriot and tell the police exactly what happened so that you can get off the hook while the police throw the book at your compatriot. But from the cartel's perspective, this is a very bad outcome because now one of them is thrown in jail for an extended period of time. And if they had both been quiet the entire time, then they both would have had a very minor charge and maybe be able to be released very, very soon. The key is that the cartel acts as a third-party enforcer to the two individuals who have been arrested. If one of them tries ratting out the other, then the cartel will punish the rat. Snitches get stitches, or perhaps something even worse. That fundamentally changes the preference structure for the two individuals. Someone who is thinking about ratting out the other now has to contemplate all of the punishment that the cartel is going to enforce on him. He's not going to want to do that. He's going to think to himself, you know what? A little bit more jail time sounds better to me than getting free and then getting killed by the cartel. I'm going to stay silent. And that works out very well for the cartel because then both parties stay silent. There's a relatively small amount of jail time that is imposed on those individuals, and the cartel gets to see them very soon. Referencing situations where you have friendly preferences, you might not individually have friendly preferences when you're looking at the bilateral relationship with the other person who has been thrown into jail, but the cartel externally forces you to have those friendly preferences. and it's that external enforcement that makes all of this work. Of course, you can see the problem here. We're talking about third-party external enforcement in a world of anarchy, and in international relations, it's hard to find that sort of third-party enforcement. You know that the United Nations tries to play this role, but oftentimes comes up lacking. Yes, the United Nations is capable of convincing countries to create peacekeeping missions and send their troops elsewhere around the world. Oftentimes, these are two situations where a couple of countries find themselves in a prisoner's dilemma and need some sort of external enforcement to get cooperation to occur. Or sometimes it's just inside of a country with a government and a rebel group also finding themselves in a prisoner's dilemma. The problem here is that third-party enforcement is only as good as the credibility and the capacity of that enforcement. If you have a bunch of peacekeepers deployed to a particular area, but they aren't going to follow through when push comes to shove, that's a big problem. In contrast to a cartel, where a cartel is well known to punish anyone who rats anyone else out, and so you know as a potential rat, you definitely don't want to do it, because they are definitely going to punish me if I do. And, moreover, the cartel is much bigger than I am, so they do have the capability to punish me. Does the United Nations have the capability of actually separating two sides if one of them were to defect on the other? Well, that's oftentimes a big question mark as well. Looking back at the military spending question, we actually have a very good solution to that sort of problem. This is a problem that exists inside of countries. Every single country has this sort of problem, where all of us individually inside of our country contribute to the national defense spending by paying our taxes. And the way that the government is able to convince us to pay our taxes is by arresting us or doing something else, garnishing our wages, very bad things if we do not pay our taxes. It would be great for me to individually live in a world where I could not pay my taxes, not face any sort of punishment, and still benefit from everyone else paying their taxes, contributing to the common defense, and me enjoying the benefits of the safety and security of that common defense. Simultaneously, though, if everyone is granted the optional right to pay taxes, suddenly no one pays taxes, and we end up in a worse world where none of us are defended. So that is how the prisoner's dilemma between me and all of my fellow Americans gets resolved. We all cooperate, or at least most of us do, and the reason that we're choosing to cooperate is because of the power of the third-party enforcer. We do not want to be in a situation where we are not complying, and then the US federal government comes and does something bad to us as a consequence. And that allows us to achieve a situation where we do have common defense. Unfortunately, that does not translate over to the NATO situation, though, because you have 32 allies without that independent third-party enforcement mechanism. They all have to figure out a way to do this themselves, and that's much harder to do than just simply say, hey, if you don't, you will get arrested. That takes us to whether the two parties can self-enforce cooperation. In other words, in the context of a prisoner's dilemma, without altering their preferences in a prisoner's dilemma, can we get them to cooperate? And the answer is yes, we can do that without self-enforcement, but it's going to require a particular set of circumstances, which may arise quite a bit in international relations, and we'll see some examples of it. But there are, again, restrictions on when it will work, and when it will not work, then we're kind of stuck in this world where we're back to defecting on one another. The key thing is to not think about a prisoner's dilemma as a single snapshot in time, but rather a game that is repeated over and over and over again between states. We will not have to choose just whether to cooperate or defect today. We'll also have to do that tomorrow, and the next day, and the day after that, and so forth. And when we open up a world of repeated play, that is where we can get self-enforcing mechanisms to work out, where we have the actors threaten to defect on one another if there is a lack of cooperation earlier on. Well, I can already start throwing up some roadblocks. As a starting point, it cannot be the case that we know when the fixed end of the interaction will be. We can think about this in just the simplest form. What happens if Iran and Saudi Arabia play a prisoner's dilemma exactly twice? In other words, Iran and Saudi Arabia right now choose whether to cooperate or defect. Then they will observe what the other one has done, and then they will choose again whether to cooperate or defect. The key problem here is that the shadow of the future prevents us from getting cooperation in the present. Think about what happens in the second stage of the two-stage prisoner's dilemma. In that second stage, whatever has happened before has already happened. Whatever benefits have been accrued through mutual cooperation or exploitation, or whatever losses have been suffered as a consequence of defection, Those have already happened, and there's no changing them. All we can do in that second stage is maximize our outcomes for the current stage that we are in, that second and final stage. Okay, how do you maximize for one stage? Well, we've already figured that out. We've already done all of the work on that. We know what happens in a one-shot prisoner's dilemma, where we play the prisoner's dilemma exactly once, aiming to maximize our individual outcomes during that one phase of the prisoner's dilemma. Both of us ultimately defect, because it does not matter what the other one does. It is always better in our own individual self-interest to defect, again, regardless of what the other one is doing. Sadly, that inevitable second stage poisons the well for the first stage. It would be great if Saudi Arabia could talk to Iran and say, hey, Iran, you know what? There's going to be a second interaction here, and it would be great if we could get some mutual cooperation today, even though that's against our individual self-interests. Because getting mutual cooperation right now is better than getting mutual defection right now, and it will be better than getting mutual defection in every single stage of this game. The problem for Iran, though, is that if Iran tries to take up Saudi Arabia's proposal of getting a cooperative outcome in this first stage, there's no way that Saudi Arabia can credibly promise Iran to reciprocate that nice cooperation from the first stage. Saudi Arabia can't say, thank you very much for the cooperation in the first stage, and now that I'm in the second stage, I'm going to cooperate as a way of saying thank you. Because in that second stage, whatever has happened already in the first stage has already happened, and there's nothing that Saudi Arabia can do to improve that first stage outcome. All it can do in the second stage is take an action that is maximizing its welfare in the second stage. And that means that Saudi Arabia is going to need to defect in the second stage. And it works for both players in the exact same way. Iran can't make the same promise to Saudi Arabia because in that second stage, Iran is going to feel the need to defect because that is what maximizes Iran's payoff in the second stage. Thus, in a two-stage prisoner's dilemma, we get mutual defection in both stages. To make matters worse, it does not matter how long the interaction is, as long as it is occurring over a fixed length of time. That is because, in the end, there is going to be a final stage. And in that final stage, both parties are going to be individually maximizing their own welfare, which means defecting. And whether it's 2 stages, or 3 stages, or 10 stages, or 1,000 stages, or 10,000 stages, that end of the interaction is going to, again, poison the well going further back. So in the second to last stage, because of everything has already happened earlier in the game cannot be changed, and whatever is going to happen at the end, that mutual defection, is set in stone, that means that the parties need to be maximizing for that second to last period, which means if you're going to individually maximize for that second to last period, you need to defect. But then that poisons the well for the period before that, and the third to last stage, if we know that everything that has already happened, and there's no changing it, and we also know that mutual defection is set in stone for the last 2 periods, nothing that we do in this third to last stage is going to affect anything before or after, so we need to maximize for this stage, which means mutual defection in this stage. And once more, that poisons the well all the way back. Whether it's 3 periods, 10 periods, or 1,000 periods, we are not going to get mutual cooperation during any period of time there. All we are going to get is mutual defection. You know, movies and TV do a very good job of depicting this sort of situation. You ever watch any apocalypse dramas, when everyone knows that the end of the world is near, and we're all going to be dead in 2 weeks or something like that? What happens? Well, you see chaos on the streets, and that's probably what would happen in the real world too. Because at that point, no one has much incentive to cooperate with someone that they do not particularly like, because the reward for cooperation now is the hope that you'll get future cooperation from them later, but there is no later when the apocalypse is near. Now, fortunately, that tends not to be the way that international relations is constructed. Unless you know something that I do not know, the end of the world is not about to happen. And when you have 2 states interacting with one another, it tends to be the case that those 2 states are still going to exist tomorrow, and the next day, and the day after that. And maybe at some point, Canada might disappear, and whatever's going on between Canada and the United States becomes irrelevant at that point. But the United States and Canada don't exactly know when that is going to happen. So when they are repeating an interaction that might look like a prisoner's dilemma, they are going to be making decisions not having a fixed endpoint to that interaction. And that actually opens up the realm of cooperation to the 2 parties. You might imagine that one of the countries would say to the other, hey, look, mutual defection is bad, and it's not just bad right now, but it's bad well into the future. And because you and I are going to be long-lived countries, that future may be a very long time indeed. And it sure would be a shame if we have mutual defection now, tomorrow, the day after that, and 10,000 years from now. So instead of doing that, let's try to do something else. Here's a pledge that I'm going to make to you. I am going to start off today by cooperating with you. And that's weird, I know, because you know and I know, it's common knowledge, that my short-run temptation is going to be to defect on you. Because in this one period, no matter what you do, for this one period, my payoff is going to be better if I defect. But don't worry, this is not actually a trick. There is something in it for me. If I cooperate with you right now, my anticipation is that you are going to mimic exactly the type of strategy that I am going to develop here with you. We're both going to start off by cooperating. And the way that we are going to reward each other is to continue cooperating as long as there has been cooperation previously. So I'm going to wake up today, I'm going to cooperate with you. You're going to do the same. We'll go to bed, there'll be the next day, we'll wake up. We have seen that we have both cooperated with each other previously, so we'll continue to cooperate in that second day. Then on the third day, we'll both wake up, we'll see that there's been mutual cooperation for the last 2 days, and we'll continue that cooperation to the third and fourth and fifth day, and so forth, until the future ends. And, well, yes, I am trying to do something nice here for both of us. My friendship with you is not limitless. Indeed, if you were to defect on me at any point, I am going to snap my fingers, and from then on, I am no longer going to cooperate with you. You know this, you're going to defect on me as well, and we'll end up in a situation where we're getting mutual defection from now until the end of time. So if you want to defect on me, go ahead. You'll get away with it for this period, and you'll do better for this period as a consequence. But there will be consequences, because after that, I am going to defect on you forever. And instead of getting this nice mutually cooperative outcome from now until the end of time, after this one defection and this one temptation payoff that you might get for just this current period, you are going to be suffering from then on. This type of strategy is known as a grim trigger. It gets the trigger word because a defection from you triggers my wrath. I switch from cooperating with you to defecting on you. And it's called a grim trigger because a single defection from you sabotages cooperation for the rest of time. Well, it turns out that grim trigger and other types of strategies that might be slightly more forgiving can actually inspire mutual cooperation between parties. And we see this all the time in international relations. It is common in trade policy especially. There are temptations to impose tariffs on another party while the other party has their tariff shield down. And what we see under those circumstances is a temptation not to actually defect on one another, but a temptation to develop those sorts of grim trigger style strategies. Each side starts off by having liberalized trade, but the moment that someone imposes tariffs on the other side is triggered and imposes a retaliatory tariff right back. And we're seeing that all sorts of places right now in the world. So, interestingly, we're shifting to a phase of enforcement in a repeated prisoner's dilemma, where previously we've seen relatively low tariffs and open trade among Western countries, especially liberalized economies, countries that are trading with one another and having reciprocal trade agreements that are trying to get those trade barriers to be absolutely as low as they possibly can to increase economic growth inside of both of those countries. And the enforcement, of course, for this is that anyone who blinks, anyone who tries to create a tariff and defect on the agreement will see reciprocal tariffs be enforced. Again, that's the period that we're currently shifting to. Another prominent example of a reciprocal agreement is the Article 5 clause inside of the North Atlantic Treaty, the foundational document of NATO. That is the an attack against one is an attack against all clause. This is built intentionally to be a reciprocal clause. In other words, I agree with you that an attack on you is also an attack on me. And so in the event of an attack on you, I come to your defense. And in that moment, it might cost me something to defend you. But the thing I get out of it is a pledge from you that you will reciprocate whenever I come under attack. And it's that expectation of reciprocation from you that disciplines my choice and convinces me that yes, it is in my own self-interest perhaps to go against my short-run self-interest because I have a more important long-run self-interest to continue getting your protection according to the North Atlantic Treaty and Article 5. Unfortunately, though, it is not all roses. There need to be a certain set of circumstances met for these sorts of reciprocal agreements to work, and for one of the parties to not have a temptation to defect on the cooperative party while the cooperative party is not ready, and get that short-run bonus to its payoff, even though there's going to be a long-run consequence which is worse than mutual cooperation. As a starting point, because this has been built into a lot of what I have already said, we need the actors to be patient. We need them to care a lot about what's going on in the future, to convince them to not try to take advantage of the individual in the present. That can be a problem for a variety of reasons. I have an asteroid on the screen. Imagine what happens if an asteroid comes loose from the asteroid belt. Or maybe we make things worse. Imagine that the solar system starts traveling through a part of space that just has a ton of debris in it. And while we cannot be sure that the Earth is going to be destroyed in any given year, suddenly the probability of Earth's destruction increases massively. Well, that's a recipe for the actors to be focusing on their payoffs for right now, because they are not confident that there is going to be a future. And if there is no future, the long-run consequence of defection today is mutual defection later on. Well, if I don't think that there's going to be much of a later on, I am going to run the risk of defecting right now, getting that tempting payoff for right now, and perhaps suffering the consequences in the future. Moving away from the post-apocalyptic dramas, something like this does happen in international relations quite frequently. I have Saddam Hussein on the screen right now. Think about a leader that is on the verge of being deposed. That can happen quite frequently. Maybe like 1 or 2 leaders are like this any given year. And when a leader is in a position like that, it is very difficult to convince other countries around that leader to cooperate with that leader in a prisoner's dilemma setting. Maybe Iran is in a prisoner's dilemma with Saddam Hussein that has absolutely nothing to do with the United States coming in and deposing Saddam Hussein. Well, if Iran is anticipating that this is going to happen shortly, Iran might think to itself, under normal circumstances, we would be cooperating with Saddam Hussein. We don't like Saddam Hussein very much at all, and we would really like to screw him over. Problem is that if we screw him over right now, he is going to reciprocate, and that's going to be worse for both of us than having cooperation sustain itself. We don't want to be in a world where we're just constantly defecting on one another. And so I am going to forego that tempting payoff for today to make sure that I sustain cooperation in the long run. Okay, but the United States is about to get rid of Saddam Hussein. So from Iran's perspective, even if Iran doesn't necessarily know that's going to happen for sure, if it's 90% likely to happen, Iran's going to be looking at its temptation payoff for defecting on Saddam while Saddam might be cooperating. And Iran's going to think to itself, that's a lot of extra value that we get by defecting. And yeah, he might punish us by defecting on us later, but also simultaneously, he's probably not long for this world. So the amount of punishment that we are going to suffer by our defection right now is going to be relatively low, so let's go ahead and do that. Of course, Saddam can anticipate all of this as well, and so he might decide to himself, there's no reason for me to cooperate with Iran either, and I'm not going to let Iran take advantage of me right now because I know Iran is going to defect on me. Iran is tempted to do so. I need to preemptively defect on Iran as well, and so I am going to do just that. And suddenly all of that cooperation is gone. One other thing to take into account is the psychological profile of the individual making the decisions. Because if their personal patience is small, it doesn't matter how long the interaction is between the two countries. That individual might decide to himself, you know what? I like this temptation payoff right now. I like trying to take advantage of the situation. I want to do as well as I can for right now. And you know what? Maybe it's going to cause me some problems in the long run, but that's a problem for future me. That is not a problem for present me. Tied together to all of that is the payoffs themselves. What does Iran get from defecting while Saudi Arabia is cooperating? That temptation payoff. What does Iran get from mutual cooperation? What does Iran get from mutual defection? And what is the differential between any two of those payoffs? For example, what if we increase Iran's payoff for defecting while Saudi Arabia cooperates? There's a reason that this is called the temptation payoff. This is what Iran gets by trying to cheat the system, and by increasing that payoff, it is making this look more tempting as compared to the baseline from before. Similarly, the spread between mutual cooperation and mutual defection also matters. Imagine that I made Iran's payoff for mutual cooperation not as good. It's still better than mutual defection, but it's not particularly exciting. Well, I have also increased the spread between the temptation and the mutual cooperation payoff, so we already know that this is bad for business. But it's even worse because mutual cooperation doesn't actually look all that attractive. What is Iran's long-run benefit for mutual cooperation? It's still better than mutual defection, but it's not much better. As a result, you're going to have a much more difficult time trying to convince Iran to cooperate under these circumstances, because it is very tempting for Iran to defect, and Iran does not feel much of a punishment for defecting in the long run, precisely because mutual cooperation is not all that great. Another concern that is very similar sounding to the temptation payoff being very large is to make sure that the interaction actually is repeated, conditional on one party choosing to defect. And I'm talking about this with the context of World War I on your screen and the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. You could think about the choices of whether to start a war as looking like a prisoner's dilemma, where both of the actors might agree that continuing the peace is better than both getting involved in a war. But if the parties think that there is going to be a significant first strike advantage, then conditional on me knowing that you're planning on not attacking, I may actively want to attack you. The way that we've been working around this situation so far is to have a repeated interaction and continued punishment in the future. But in the context of a first strike advantage, if that first strike advantage really is pivotal, and you start a war while I am caught flat-footed, I may be completely destroyed. At which point, there actually isn't a second round of this interaction. I can't punish you precisely because I have disappeared, precisely because the temptation payoff was so darn tempting. Of course, the irony of World War I is that all of those planners were wrong. The first strike advantages were not pivotal, and in fact there were quite a bit of defensive advantages of waiting for the other side to come to you. Nevertheless, this type of concern is still very much relevant in the world of nuclear strategy. If I launch a bunch of nuclear weapons at you, it's possible I will be able to disable everything that you have in your country that might be able to punish me in response. And that could get a breakdown in mutual cooperation and lead to some very nasty and ugly fighting. More subtly, you need to be able to observe the defections. I might be defecting on you over and over and over again, but if you don't actually see it, that can't trigger your punishment strategy. You might just be sitting there thinking to yourself, well, I'm not seeing anything that's going wrong, so I guess I'm going to continue to cooperate because that's what I'm supposed to do. But that would be a naive thing to do, because if I know I can defect on you without you seeing it, then if you are going to try to play one of those cooperation contingent strategies, I'm just going to take advantage of the situation. And in turn, you should deny me that chance in the first place by just defecting on me from the start. You can think about how the technology of observation and monitoring has changed over time, not only over the last few decades, but over just even the last few years. There are a whole bunch more drones out there in the world, and if you're thinking about trying to secure a peace along a ceasefire line, one of the things that you might need to get that to work is to be able to observe another country breaking the terms of the ceasefire. Well, a lot of drones might be able to help out with that. Lastly, it is a lot harder to get this to work when you have cooperation among a whole bunch of different individuals. When it's just one-on-one, you can condition your strategy specifically in response to the other country. But for something like NATO spending, it's a lot more complicated. Again, you have 32 allies. And you can imagine a situation where 31 out of the 32 are all complying with what they are supposed to be doing in, say, defense spending on a yearly basis. But then what do you do with that one country that is not actually following through on what they're supposed to do? If you follow through on what the Grim Trigger strategy says, another country has defected, it is time for me to defect, which means that I am no longer going to spend on my military what I am supposed to according to the terms of the pledge. Well, that seems problematic because you have 31 countries that are all following through on what they're supposed to be doing, which means you have quite a bit of cooperation and quite a bit of security that is collectively provided. And suddenly, all of that is going to go away because a single country broke the terms of the deal. But then again, if you do not follow through on the terms of the punishment, That allows that one country to get away with it, and then you have a next country maybe the next year thinking, should I be the second country to try to cheat the system? And then the third country, and then the fourth country, and then the fifth country, and then suddenly the entire system breaks down. Now, there are ways of resolving this problem. You can get grim trigger strategies to work when there are 32 countries interacting with one another, or 100 or more. You do not end up in a situation as simple, though, as what works with a two-party interaction, which is why we're not going to be going into the depths of that right now. Instead, I want to take a step back and reflect on what we've learned today. We've been examining a prisoner's dilemma scenario, an interaction where parties have individual incentives to not act cooperatively with one another, but the collective non-cooperation that results is worse for both parties than mutual cooperation. That was the bad news. The good news is that, even in the absence of a third-party enforcer, we can get parties to interact with one another in a cooperative way. It just takes going through some extra hoops to get it to work properly. But like I said when I first introduced these relatively simple strategies, cooperate and defect, that can get us somewhere, but it can't get us as deep as we might want with some interesting interactions in international relations. So what we will do next time is try to put some flesh on these bones, specifically in the realm of warfare. We're going to talk about how parties might negotiate with one another to resolve a war, as it is about to happen, and also eventually how parties might try to resolve wars once they have started. In the meantime, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.